Good morning, everybody. My name is Uri Dromi. I run the Jerusalem Press Club, and you're most welcome. Chag Purim Sameach to everybody, to you, to our viewers on YouTube and other media outlets. Please turn off your cell phones or switch them to silent mode. And today we are privileged to host Rabbi Avraham Cooper, the Associate Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is a leading Jewish human rights organization, and it's a renowned Museum of Tolerance. Rabbi Cooper is a long-time activist for Jewish and human rights causes. Since he came to Los Angeles in '77, together with Rabbi Marvin Heyer, founded the Wiesenthal Center. You all received his bio, so I'm skipping.
My mother is not here, so you don't have to read the rest of what she wrote.
Okay. Rabbi Cooper is an expert on digital terrorism, on hate and social media, and meets regularly with the political and religious leaders from the Vatican, Paris, Berlin, Argentina, Azerbaijan, etc. Coordinated the international conferences with UNESCO and did many other good things. So today we would like to hear about recent trends or rise of anti-Semitism, and you take on this. Usually 20-25 minute introduction and then Q&A.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Rabbi Cooper,
Uri, so good to see you.
Yes,
after all
here.
these years.
Same here.
It's an honor to be here in Yerushalayim at the Press Club, and I guess the topic on everyone's mind right now is the resurgent anti-Semitism, not only in Europe, but also a lot of high-profile incidents recently in the United States. And you could really start in many different ways. I think the most important point to make, if we're talking about the U.S. as a starting point for our discussion, is that the problem of anti-Semitism in the United States has been fairly constant. It's been around a long time. For example, 2 weeks ago I was being interviewed by a younger reporter, and now at my age almost every reporter is a younger reporter. And
not this one.
Okay, I have to get your address then and make sure you're at the rest of my presentation.
You could be my son.
Okay. Abnei v'esrim v'shavua. As Dershowitz says, why should you die on your birthday? But in terms of anti-Semitism, we have a constant now for decades in the U.S. And these are bared out by the statistics from the FBI. The number one target of hate crimes in the U.S. based on race every year, without fail, are African Americans. And the number one target of religious-based hate crimes in the United States, despite the fact that we're somewhere at about 2% of the population, are Jews. So anti-Semitic incidents are not new in the U.S. And when I mentioned to the reporter that, by the way, the majority of major Jewish institutions in the United States, that means JCCs, synagogues, Jewish day schools, pretty much from the time that you were in Los Angeles, the issue of perimeter security has been with us for decades. It may not be as apparent as, let's say, in Europe. I remember 10 years ago I was at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and I had to be there over Shabbat. I went to the very lovely lady at the concierge desk and asked her, you know, could you point me in a direction so this evening I can go to synagogue? She said, no problem, come with me. We walked outside. So you walk down the 2 to the second traffic light, you make a right, and you keep walking until you come to the soldiers with machine guns and the military half-track. And there you're at the synagogue. And she didn't say it in a way to insult me, just that that was the accepted sort of norm. Going back before 9/11, ISIS, this was already the norm, unfortunately, because of both extreme neo-Nazi activity, but also already terrorist threats as well to Jewish institutions. So in the US, it really isn't new. But what's very interesting, I was thinking about, this reporter was so shocked. When I go to my synagogue on Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles, there's a plainclothes policeman on the front and another one in the back, and you never think about it. We have kind of absorbed and accepted for us that this has been the norm. And I know that part of what I'm supposed to talk about today is like, what do we do to fight it? I think one important issue is we need to begin to share with our neighbors, including people who go to churches. I was just brought the parents of Hadar Golden, who were in Los Angeles, the soldier whose body is still being kept by Hamas. I took them to the King Fahd Mosque for a meeting. There's no security there. You don't have to go through. And that is a mosque where one of the September 11th, 19 prayed. So in part, I think what we have to do is to make sure that our neighbors understand what the price that we pay to follow our constitutional rights. Freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. And I understand very well why we don't go around making a big deal over it. Number one, it's not good for security. But also, number two, psychologically, I think that American Jews realize this is the best of times, not just the worst of times. We don't want to get on the victimization parade again. We're not interested in advertising that we're the #1 target of anti-Semitism. But with that kind of quiet approach comes with a price, which is our neighbors have no idea about the basic reality that we have. So if that's the case, why are we hearing so much about anti-Semitism now? For one thing, whoever the individuals or group that are behind the threats made to Jewish community centers, the ADL, various synagogues, whoever's behind it is very shrewd. And let me explain to you why. Baruch Hashem, so far there hasn't been a single bomb, just a threat. So on our staff at the Wiesenthal Center, we have our film division called Mariah Films. We have our own studio. Rabbi Heyer has 2 Oscars. One was not enough for him, so you have 2. We're now finishing editing 2 documentaries, one on Shimon Peres, Zechrono Livracha, 51 hours of interviews finished about 6 weeks before he was niftar, before he passed. And the other for next year, the kind of forgotten hero really, David Ben-Gurion. Most people in America around the world, no clue who this man was. So our editor, I'll just say her name is Aviva, she has young kids, and one of them is at the JCC in the West Side, which Uri knows very well. They've now received twice those computerized calls and threats. And so the trauma for her 5-year-old to be trotted out of the facility when he's in kindergarten twice, and on top of that, the Jewish parents having to deal with it, multiply that by 20,000, let's say, families around the United States. And you have, I must say, a very nefarious but brilliant tactic that works, which is to strike fear into the hearts of Jewish families. In that particular case, we've called for, we actually wrote to Sessions, the Attorney General of the United States, asking for a special task force. You know, it could be as simple as a couple of 15-year-olds who understand the technologies really well, or it could be some group overseas, because now there's some indication that shortly after a phone call, let's say, to the US address. There are also phone calls going to UK Jewish addresses. So they're beginning to, to deal with it. Because it involves internet technology, we've called for a special task force involving the people who control the high tech in the world, and perhaps even the NSA, simply to find out who's behind it. In the meantime, I think we have to say, unfortunately, that the bad guys have found a tactic that works for them, meaning everyone's talking about it, people feel uneasy, families feel uneasy, children are traumatized. Now, I think also it's important to sort of look at a few other factors now in the United States, and that is that it's my 40th year at the Wiesenthal Center. So for most of the time at the center, in conjunction also with other Jewish groups and other human rights groups and watchdog groups, we, I think, collectively tried very hard not to allow anti-Semitism to become a left-right issue. The fight for religious freedom and equality and a level playing field, in our view, was and is, it's a responsibility across the board. It should not become part of cultural wars or political disputes or debates. And that means that when a Sikh temple is hit in LA, or God forbid, when you had the shooting, gunning down of 7 people who were at a prayer meeting on the East Coast and at a church, a black church. So that night, for the first time in my life, I happen to be an Orthodox Jew. I go to mosque all the time, but generally not to a church. That night, I joined many people in the Los Angeles community, went to the senior church of that group in South Central Los Angeles to be there for the memorial program, because it was a time to stand in solidarity. Okay, so we don't have that situation right now in America. That's not where we're at. It's extremely unfortunate, and in a lot of ways things have become very politicized. I would tie it, or I would point to one major factor, which I don't think has gotten enough exposure and review even in the United States. And that is social media. Social media is a complete game changer, and we have just, today in Tel Aviv it is Purim. Tomorrow here will be Purim. Well, in my job, I treat it that every day is Purim. We have a completely upside down world, and the insight, if you will, that I'd like to present is really based on the fact that we have now for 22 years a project called Digital Terrorism and Hate. We are anyway every day looking to see how the evildoers, the extremists, the terrorists, the hate groups, how they're leveraging internet technologies, who's doing it, what their approach is, et cetera, and then trying to pressure the companies to do more when applicable, governments as well. So when we had the Purim Festival in the United States, otherwise known as the last presidential election campaign, which was plenty of v'nahafochus, and is still v'nahafochu every day. Besides the fact that Donald Trump used Twitter as his main campaign vehicle, we also saw...
And presidency.
And presidency. I think especially, they tell me, during the 25 hours of Shabbat when his son-in-law is not around to stop him from pushing the button. But the whole nexus really for the campaign, especially when it came to the area of the extremists, people like David Duke and other far-rights, some of them blatant anti-Semites like him, others skating the border, they were prepositioned to actually utilize the social media to make sure they were heard every single day. So number one, when you give someone an endorsement and you're part of a KKK or neo-Nazi group that has maybe 100 followers, who cares? But if you're on social media and you create this sounding board very effectively, and then the other parallel piece to that, which is something which will unfortunately be with us, you can tell me if it's now part of the Israeli scene, I hope not, is that for the first time, many young Jews, American Jews, including those who are journalists, from Ben Shapiro on the right to many, many reporters. I remember one particular call from an AP reporter in London, an American Jewish kid, who had just written a pretty nasty article about candidate Trump. And she got vicious anti-Semitic threats delivered right to her inbox. You had maybe, I don't know if it's a few dozen or a few hundred people that were looking at who was writing about what, and these so-called, let's call them these bigot online activists, they almost ran Ben Shapiro out of town in Los Angeles. He's a conservative Republican writer, and a pretty good one, on the right. And when he didn't fall into the worldview that this particular candidate was the best candidate for Republicans, a lot of these racists, bigots, I would call them neo-Nazis, went after Shapiro all the way across the spectrum to people covering the candidates. And I'm not here to talk about whether their articles were balanced or not balanced. The bottom line is it became extremely personal, and the swiftness by which these kinds of attacks were launched were only made possible by virtue of the internet, and especially social media. That is part also of the reality today in the US and probably elsewhere. Extremely ugly, a lot of ugliness going front and center to the most powerful communicative and marketing concepts and vehicles ever created that we call collectively the internet. So my argument would be that I don't think that the statistics on hate crimes are necessarily going to go up, but the perception of an environment of hate is very much there because the evildoers, the bad guys, pre-positioned themselves online now for quite a few years. The rest of us are, I would say, only waking up to the issue. And then there's, of course, one huge complication, and that is how much of the responsibility for those kinds of expressions should or should not be placed before, in the real time during the campaign, the Trump campaign, and now especially you have the President of the United States is Donald Trump. Are they doing enough? Are they doing it fast enough? Has he done enough to distance himself from what we would consider to be the lunatic fringe? And that's where things get very murky and frankly very political. And as a result, sort of like the usual suspects being rounded up to discuss anti-Semitism, let's say with the Presidential Advisory Committee or even the U.S. Attorney, I'm not sure who's going to be invited to that rodeo, because some Jewish organizations and individuals have openly come out in opposition of the president, for a variety of reasons, some of which may or may not be valid, but as an institution that is focused in many ways primarily on trying to combat anti-Semitism and also to stand in defense of Israel and the rights of Jewish people everywhere, we are doing our best to stay true to that mandate. And these days, it's not so simple. Just one example, the big question mark about Steve Bannon that took place in real time during the campaign. So some Jewish groups came out and said the man was an anti-Semite. That was picked up because in campaigns everything is superheated and charged immediately, especially now with the internet. But as it happens on Bannon, I had been on a panel for the Jewish Journal in Los Angeles, And on that panel, who I met for the first time, a guy named Joel Pollack. Joel Pollack is originally from South Africa, a pretty good writer, fiercely independent personality, I can tell you from my experience on the panel. And he writes, among other things, for Breitbart.com, Jewish guy. So I saw, in the midst of this whole big blowout, that it turns out that Joel Pollack reported to Bannon. And so I watched to see what Pollack said about Bannon. And he said, I work for the man's not an anti-Semite. We did not call him an anti-Semite. And as a result, later on in the week, that stuff came back, but what was really missed and remains an open question is the so-called alt-right, which is a very broad, you don't know if you really call it a movement. It's a broad brush. I think you have among the people on the alt-right, or people calling themselves alt-right, are bigots who are trying to sneak into the mainstream under that kind of banner. And then you have all sorts of people with their own interesting ideas, shall we say, not necessarily ones I would agree with. But, and the question remains, let's say, about a Steve Bannon in real time. I mean, our approach about Mr. Bannon, about the current administration is to play it. He's in a public position. If he says or does something that crosses the line, we're going to come out against him. Insofar, for example, with President Trump's first shot at the immigration issue, stopping immigration, we came out against it because we thought some of the wrong people were being included in the mix, and the idea of putting all Muslims, whether from America or anywhere else in the world, into one overriding basket is simply not acceptable. On the other hand, as long as we're on the issue of immigration, we do notice that this administration is talking about, for the first time American officials, you know, the number one endangered minority today in the world are Christians, numerically, about 100 million people. Some of those people don't necessarily love Jews very much, but if you want to know who's on the front line ethnically cleansed in Iraq, you know what's going on in Syria, the Coptic Christians in Egypt, Boko Haram targeting Christians, literally like Nazis in Nigeria. We can go on and on and on. So it's been the Wiesenthal Center, my colleague Rabbi Adlerstein and I have written in the Wall Street Journal, after a conversation with Lord Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who pointed out a very interesting thing, it's already 2 years ago, that there are two groups in the Middle East that generally don't go into the UN camps, because if they do, they're afraid they'll get killed in the camps. Christians and Yazidis. We've met, the Wiesenthal Center, of course, has met with representatives of the Yazidis. Now, even going back to the previous administration, we said, if you're worried about ISIS and the proper vetting, guess what? There are two groups of people probably not going to be members of ISIS. Yazidis have almost been wiped out by them, and Christians. The previous administration just took the fact saying we use UN lists. That's who comes into the country after we vet them. The current administration, which is still getting its traction in many different ways, has at least begun to speak, you know, to that particular issue. But on the question of anti-Semitic acts in the U.S., there was just now, I think a few days ago, a meeting with Homeland Security, convened by Homeland Security, with different Jewish organizations. Whatever we can do on the physical perimeter, whatever we can do to make sure the intelligence services of the United States include this issue on their list, whatever we can do to continue to train law enforcement in the U.S., which our Museum of Tolerance in L.A. Is very involved with, we should do all of that. But the bottom line about, as everybody in this room knows, you cannot legislate hatred out of existence. And I think the most important lesson for younger Jews who are now stepping into positions of responsibility is we can't win this battle on our own. First of all, anti-Semitism is a problem for non-Jews, not just for Jews. Secondly, despite what anti-Semites and much of the continent of Asia believes, we're only 2% of the population in the United States. We cannot, on our own, win any of these struggles, which means we need to create, or sometimes recreate, coalitions. That is very much complicated by this incredible, I think we have to say, cultural war that's underway. I'll put it to you this way. On the Sunday morning after inauguration, you know, my boss, Rabbi Heyer, as they said on, I saw one koteret from Israel, he was the Baal Maftir for Trump. He gave the prayer right after Trump at the inauguration, the first Orthodox rabbi ever. And I did with one of the Israeli radio shows on Sunday, because my Hebrew is better by far than my boss, but not good enough for me to show my face to my former Yeshiva Flatbush teachers. So just before the gentleman said, okay, before I let you go, Rabbi, he said in Hebrew, so let me get this straight. You're telling me that 1 million people came out on Erev Shabbat to celebrate Trump becoming president. And on Shabbat, 1 million other people showed up to protest in Washington in the same place against President Trump? I said, yes. He said, well, how do you explain that to my listeners in Israel? I said, very simple. That's American democracy. It is, but beyond that, I think we are seeing cultural war underway. I wrote an op-ed, actually 3 to how the left coast of the Protocols of Zion can impact from such a distance, especially when you're in places like Bahrain 2 Sundays ago or Argentina later this week. We try, but sometimes, you know, we just can't control it.
She also asked about the leverages.
So I think, let's say this, it was an unforced error. It should never happen again. And we're very deeply disturbed that there were some people within the administration who, instead of saying, you know what, we blew it because we don't have enough. Anytime there's a statement, my friend Fred Ballitzer, who was in the Reagan White House, he said, what's going on here? Any statement, it could be about Tu B'Shvat. 4 people will see the statement. 4 people will vet it. So I'm hoping that when they have these people in place, A, it won't happen, but if it does, we know where to go. So that was part of the issue there. And now if you can circle back to your first question.
Leverage.
That's very interesting. So let me say this about leverage. Number one, shaming works, except when my first meeting with Twitter was 2 days after they got a check for $1.7 billion. But since then, you know, and I think the second point is very important, is that the people running Silicon Valley are now having children. They themselves are getting older. And especially my longest relationship goes back with Facebook, and they're far from perfect. I know about the lawsuit here in Kol HaKavod, but what we find more and more are people who are saying, well, you know, we're not in business to make it easy for the bad guys. And believe me, there are things that they could be doing digitally to make it more difficult than you and I can imagine. I'll give you just one interesting example. This was already way back, 10 years ago. One of the companies, I won't mention which, they did a pilot project. They sent out emails to teenagers and said the following: we have reason to believe that you've been a victim of online bullying. If you need help, please respond to this email and we'll give you a list of individuals and institutions in your area who can help you. Is that a great idea? Terrific. And then wait 15 seconds and then ask yourself the obvious question.
How do they know?
How the hell do they know that this kid has been online bullied?
Because they track them.
Because when you walk by the shoe store where you bought a year and a half ago and you didn't stop in, you're getting already on your... So the answer is, forget the FBI, Forget Big Brother. We have voluntarily given up our privacy to these companies. It's not anything they took illegally. And they know all about marketing. They know about our habits better than we do. Now, I'm not happy about that, but that's the reality everyone is in. And they dropped that particular project, but it does mean it gives you some shemetz, or say just a little bit of an idea of if the collective genius of Silicon Valley spent a little bit more time about how to make it more difficult for these kinds of dangerous people to use their services, we would all be a lot safer.
We are wrapping up.
In France, we had a story about more than 100 years ago about an innocent officer who was found guilty of a dreyfus affair.
Right.
Now in America, you have a guilty person who got jail sentence, but who, instead of having 3, 4, 5 years like anyone who received in America, he got 30 years, and now you know also the condition of his liberation in stroke. What do the residential centers think about the situation, and what does it do to help this situation move?
You could probably have a speaker just on that topic, by the way, which wouldn't be a bad one to talk about the legislatures in democracy, the judicial in democracies. We're going to have now a struggle as we do, it's like a cycle. You already are hearing from mostly the right, but some from the left saying, what do you mean hate crime? A crime is a crime. Why do we need special rules and laws and sentences for a hate crime? I think people are going to say it less now as they see the impact of just the threats, let's say, to parents at a JCC. But every generation has to sort of relearn it. I can't make an overarching statement about the American judiciary, but I want to tell you about one federal judge in Los Angeles, amazing man, in which he had many young people brought before him that were 1 foot already in the system, in jail. And he was so fed up with it because he saw that 2 years later they just came out being better criminals, or worse. He started his own project in conjunction with our Museum of Tolerance, taking the young people at risk. These are not 5-star academic students, and putting them into actually a peer situation where they, and it was binding legally, where they are often brought cases involving kids their age in similar circumstances, and coming up with pretty good results. So I would say my own view is we should invest a lot more with young people to keep them out of the system, but anyone who crosses the line in terms of a hate crime against any group and any religious institution, we should continue to increase the price that has to be paid. And that's why it's so important also to find all the perpetrators of the threats against the JCC, because the longer it goes on, we now see there'll be more copycats, and creates an environment that we know will be very unhealthy for our community and others as well.
I might not have been clear on my question.
Please.
But my question was more related to Paula.
I completely missed it.
But
Okay,
the question,
so
I forgot to mention the name.
I didn't want the name.
Okay, well, I'll talk, well, it's okay. We're here at a democracy too, I think, just speak into the water. Jonathan Pollard, who I visited twice in jail, once when he was in solitary. My view about Jonathan Pollard was that the American system should have thrown the book at him, and the book should have been the same one that they threw at other spies who did similar things.
And worse.
And worse. There is clearly a profound political aspect to why he was in jail for so many decades. I have my own theories, but he's out now, and I'm not interested in making tsuras for him. I would just also say, because when I met him in solitary, and a federal officer from a certain agency was with us, I told him, look, I'm going to talk to him about Torah now, You may not understand it, they're recording it anyway. So he took out the USA Today crossword puzzle. And then when I finished, I said, okay, now, so we talked about, it was Parshat Pinchas. Pinchas is the example of a Jew who felt he had to go across the line in order to save his people. And we talked very explicitly about it. Now, he has said many things to many people over the years. He made it clear he didn't want to talk to us anymore. It's fine. What he went through, I wouldn't wish on our enemies. But it was clear from our conversation then that he understood that he was not a Pinchas. Maybe his motivations were the right motivations, but he had his eyes wide open. He swore allegiance to the United States. He broke it. Was he a traitor? Absolutely not. I was very close to his father, who was a great American hero from the Second World War. And unfortunately, Jonathan wasn't even allowed to go to his funeral. I would just say that Israel owed him more. And if you ask me, there are 3 points to this triangle: U.S., Israel, and Pollard. Who do I trust to tell us the full truth? No one. Absolutely no one. I'm just glad that he's out. I hope that the good Lord will give him enough years and that the current administration will finally allow him to come in. Also, when I was with him way back when, he said he wasn't going to write a book. I think in many ways maybe that's really what people were most afraid of. And beyond that, yeah, I'm looking forward to find out the full truth also, but I'm not holding my breath. It's a terrible tragedy, and part of it was meant to send a signal to American Jews. Don't you ever try something like that. And I've spoken to many American Jews who are in service, various service parts of the American government, who say they themselves paid a heavy price for it. The Pollard affair was a horrible parsha for everyone. But I will say one thing. Jonathan Pollard was no Dreyfus. Dreyfus was innocent.
That's what I say.
Jonathan was not.
That's what I say.
So that's it.
So there you go. Thank you very much, Rabbi Cooper, for fascinating presentation, and kol hakavod on your work at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Thank you guys for coming. One second, as we always do with the esteemed speakers, I want to give you a card, membership card, associate member of the Jerusalem Press, and it entails some benefits. So,
Rabbi, appreciate that. Thank you.
Bye-bye.